All right, guys, now we're going to go into the vertebral column. Not a page I would spend much time on. I would skim these quickly. It talks about, though, how there's 33 bones. 7 of them are cervical. That's what I would pay attention to, and those are movable. And I want you to look forward in your notes after you've skimmed this to those cervical vertebrae. Okay, so as we look at our notes here, the things that have been hit on the old test, just 2 things that kind of consistently get hit over and over. The atlanto-occipital joint, providing this yes motion, right? This up and down motion, right? And this atlanto-axial joint providing the no motion, that back and forth motion. That seems to get hit occasionally, and it's something I'd pay attention to. The rest of it, guys, I would just kind of skim and move on with your life. All right, guys, now we're going to talk about the orbit for a little bit. And if you haven't read this yet, you can scroll to the next page. You can see we have a box there that kind of summarizes the different walls of the orbit. And much of this we've already talked about, but just kind of a summary of a couple key things. Remember we said the great Z, greater wing plus the zygomatic, is going to lead to the lateral wall. We said the roof is going to be made up of the lesser wing plus the frontal bone. So we say front less. When you think of the medial wall here, like to kind of by your nose, obviously, so you can think SMEL, S-M-E-L, and those are in your notes, sphenoid maxilla, ethmoid, and lacrimal bones, right? Those are going to be the key ones there. The floor of the orbit, if you're curious, you can read in our notes, there's 3 bones that make up the floor, and a dumb little phrase I remember for that is, my pal gets his Z's on the floor, like a friend that's like sleeping over at your house or something. My pal gets his Z's on the floor. Maxillary, palatine, zygomatic, those are the 3 bones. The key one to know there is obviously going to be the maxillary bone, because underneath the maxillary bone is going to be the maxillary sinus. And if they ask you on boards something like which of the following bones is going to be the weakest in the orbit, that's the maxillary bone. If they ask you which one's going to be the thinnest, you're going to say the ethmoid bone. That's on the medial wall. Okay, so pay attention that the thinnest is not the weakest. The thinnest is the ethmoid. The weakest is going to be the maxillary bone. All right, guys, as we get into the muscles of the orbit, we've already had a lot of these already, so it's going to be a good review for you. But just as a reminder, remember cranial nerve 3 opens the eye. So remember that visual we drew earlier where we had the cranial nerve 3 right there, like kind of a scaffolding holding up that eyeball, right? So you want to think of 3 as doing that. Remember, the levator muscle is what's going to do that. It elevates the eye, right? So that's going to be innervated by cranial nerve 3. So again, 3 is the nerve that does it, but remember it's a levator palpebral muscle that does that, right? So as we get into the actions of the muscles, you can kind of scroll down in your notes until you see a chart that we just put into the text this year that'll help kind of summarize everything. You can see in this chart there's 6 extraocular muscles. All of you guys know that. And when you think of those 6, you want to think the ones that have recti in it are really easy, because the recti muscles are just up, down, left, right. So look at my right eye here for a second. The superior rectus is going to move it up. Inferior rectus is going to move it down. The medial rectus is going to move it towards the nose. The lateral rectus is going to move it away from the nose. So if they ask you anything about a primary action, like the number one thing those guys do, it's really easy. All the recti muscles do is up, down, left, right. When you think about the obliques, you're going to know they're going to deal with torsion, right? So superior oblique is going to be in torsion, right? Remember earlier, cranial nerve 4. The superior oblique, we talked about the right superior oblique palsy, right? The patient's going to need to tilt their head to the left because they can't intort. So say to yourself, all superiors intort. You can write that in your margin if you want. That's kind of a rule that you always want to remember. Some people like the phrase like inferiors extort, like inferior people, like bad people, they steal, extortion. Either one, superior intort, inferior extort, whatever your flavor is, doesn't matter. That will help you big time on the test. Okay, so that's one thing I would remember. Number 2, I'd write my margin, all obliques, it doesn't matter which one, all obliques abduct, abduct. Okay, all obliques abduct. That's the other key thing. You're going to see that that's going to ring true when you look at that chart as well. And last but not least, if you know the recti go up, down, left, right, you just got to remember the number one action of the obliques. Number one action of the obliques is going to be intorsion and extorsion. Okay, that's the key thing you want to remember. Now let me draw this visual for you to kind of help you remember the actions of the muscles. It's quick and easy and something that can reinforce some good structure on this diagram. All right, guys, let's look at the next heading that says orbital vessels. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick way to think of the drainage to and from the eye. So let's do this together. I'm going to draw this out for you. So when you think about the eye, all the blood in the eye is going to drain from the eye to the cavernous sinus, right? And it does that through the superior and, do you remember what it was from before? Superior and inferior ophthalmic veins, yes. So all that's going to the cavernous sinus, right? And you guys know the cavernous sinus is going to go where? It's going to go, all roads lead to the Sigmoid sinus, yes. Sigmoid sinus is then going to drain from the internal jugular vein, right? Then it's going to the heart. You know, from the heart, it's going to go back to the eye. Now we're arterial supply. So you want to think the major branch off the heart that's going to go to the eye is going to be the internal carotid. The internal carotid gives off the ophthalmic artery. You remember me stressing that before. We said the internal carotid had how many branches, guys? 4 branches. One of those was the ophthalmic artery. The ophthalmic artery branches to the eye. You don't need to know this for your test, but ophthalmic artery has like 7 branches, all to the different areas of the eye. It doesn't matter for you. What you need to know is the ophthalmic artery is the branch that gives arterial blood supply to the eye. So that's the big picture. Hopefully that reinforces what we talked about earlier as well. All right, guys, now we're going to get into the overview of the ear, our last big section that's kind of exclusive to this gross anatomy section. There's some other stuff after this I'm going to kind of go pretty quickly on and kind of show you a few little mnemonics and things to help you remember them. But this is the last big thing I want you to kind of hone in on. Just a few questions, but I think I can pinpoint where they're at just based on looking at old tests and what you typically see on standardized tests in this area. So I'm going to start with a visual here. Take a look at this. You already have this same visual in your notes, so look at it with me. You guys probably remember things like there's an outer ear, a middle ear, and an inner ear. The middle ear is what has the ossicles, the incus, malleus, and stapes, and this is what typically gets nailed on old tests. We'll talk about that in a second. You also want to know that the inner ear has the semicircular canals, right? And look what they do, angular acceleration, whereas the cochlea responds to the organ of Corti, right? So when you think about that inner ear, make sure you know semicircular is going to do this, like angular acceleration, whereas the vestibule is going to do linear acceleration, okay? Linear, yes and no, not the angular stuff that the semicircular canals are going to do. So let me show you some basic questions that were asked on this in the past. Sure, you hope you get that question. Pretty simple, huh? I just want to build your confidence a little bit to show you some of the easy stuff that does come up on boards. But let me show you another question that was a little trickier on sound as well. All right, guys, so let's go to your notes where it says functions of the auditory ossicles to review this, okay? This is big. So if you look here, it says the auditory ossicles, malleus, incus, stapes, right? They increase the force but decrease the amplitude. That's been on multiple old tests, all about decreasing amplitude when it comes to sound. That's big. Now, if you guys are trying to figure out what muscles are doing this, you know it's malleus, incus, stapes, but the technical questions are right here. They're bolded in your notes. Look down here with me. You can see the tensor tympani muscle is innervated by cranial nerve V3, right? The third division of the trigeminal. You guys heard me say earlier, the third division of the trigeminal does muscles of mastication, right? But I told you it also goes to the ear, and that was something to pay attention to. And here's the moment on why we need to know that. And your test question will likely be that the tensor tympani, right, innervates the malleus muscle, right? That acts on the malleus. Let me say it that way. V3 innervates tensor tympani, which acts on the malleus, right? So just a quick little visual on how I do this is here. Take a look at this with me. So you want to know that V3 is going to innervate the tympani, which is going to act on the malleus, right? Just like you also want to know that cranial nerve 7 is going to act on the stapedius muscle, right? And this is going to be easy, right? Because you want to know stapedius is going to stop the stapes. Say that to yourself. Stapedius is going to stop the stapes. That's an easy thing to remember. You want to remember cranial nerve 7 is going to do the stapedius, cranial nerve 3 is going to do the other, okay? That's kind of the technical questions that should come from that. But let me show you one more just to make sure you got this down.